Hello everyone. This is a revision lecture for Macroeconomics Unit 4 Inflation and Business Cycle. In this session, we will quickly revise the main concepts of inflation, business cycle, and Hawtrey's monetary theory in a clear and exam-oriented way. The lecture is divided into two parts. The first part covers inflation and its meaning, types, causes, effects, and anti-inflationary policy. And the second part covers the business cycle, including its meaning, characteristic, phases, and Hawtrey's explanation of cyclical fluctuations. The aim of this revision is simple: to help you connect all the ideas in one flow so that you can answer both short and long questions confidently. Keep in mind the key relation among prices, output, employment, money, credit, and policy while we move through the unit. In part A of this lecture, we will study inflation. We will study the meaning and types of inflation, demand pull theory, cost push theory, effects of inflation on production and distribution, and anti-inflationary policies. These topics explain why prices rise and how inflation affects different sections of the economy. In part B, business cycle, we'll cover the meaning of business cycle, its characteristics, phases, Hawtrey's monetary theory, expansion and contraction phases, and the critical evaluation of Hawtrey's theory. This part explains the repeated ups and downs of economic activity over time. Now we begin Unit 4, Section A, Inflation. In this section, we will study inflation, its causes, its effects, and the policies used to control it. Inflation is one of the most important macroeconomic problems because it directly affects prices, purchasing power, production, and income distribution. Let us start with the meaning of inflation. Inflation refers to a sustained and continuous rise in the general price level over a period of time. So when price rises continuously, the purchasing power of money falls. In simple words, the same amount of money can buy fewer goods and services than before. Now, let us understand the types of inflation according to the rate. The first type of inflation is creeping inflation. When rate is below 3% per year, that inflation is known as creeping inflation. This is a mild form of inflation and is often considered manageable and in some cases even helpful for growth. The second type is walking inflation, which lies between 3 to 10% per year. This is a moderate rise in prices and should be treated as a warning sign for the economy. The third type of inflation is known as galloping inflation, where the rate rises between 10 and 100% per year. This is a serious condition because it creates instability in the economy and harms consumers, producers, and investors. And the final type of is hyperinflation, where the price rise is above 100% per year. This is the most dangerous form of inflation and can lead to economic collapse if it is not controlled. So, to summarize, inflation is not just a rise in prices, it is a continuous fall in the value of money. And the severity of inflation depends on how fast prices are rising. Now we come to the demand pull theory of inflation. This theory explains inflation as a result of excess aggregate demand. Excess aggregate demand. In simple words, when there is uh, too much money chasing too few goods, price begins to rise. Now, the core idea is that if aggregate demand exceeds aggregate supply at the full employment level, the economy cannot produce more real output. So the extra demand only pushes up the general price level. This is why demand pull inflation is often called inflation caused by demand pressure. Now, there are several important causes of demand pull inflation. These include an increase in money supply, higher government expenditure, increase in disposable income, expansion of bank credit and easy monetary policy, higher exports, then rapid population growth, and deficit financing by the government. All these factors increase the total spending in the economy. Now, if I have to explain the demand pull theory of inflation in very layman terms, is say when household, farms, and governments all try to buy more goods and services at the same time, but the production does not rise enough, so the prices goes up. So demand pull inflation is basically a situation of excess demand. So here in this particular case, here inflation does not begin from the side of production. It begins from the side of demand. As long as output can still rise, the prices may not rise very sharply. But once the full employment is reached, further increases in demand, mainly leading to higher prices, not higher output. Now, let us continue with the aggregate demand and aggregate supply framework of the demand pull inflation. This shows what happens when aggregate demand shifts to the right from aggregate demand curve AD1 to AD2. As demand increases, the price level rises from P1 to P2. At the same time, the output may also rise at first, but only to up to the point of full employment. Once the economy reaches the full employment level, it cannot produce much more real output. So after that point, any further rise or in demand or increase in demand may mainly raise the prices rather than output. This is the key idea behind the Keynesian view. So, according to Keynes, demand inflation becomes important only after full employment is reached. Before that, higher demand may increase both output and employment. The monetarist view gives emphasis on the role of money supply. When the money supply increases, aggregate demand shifts outward, and that pushes the price level upward. So, from the monetarist side, inflation is closely related to excess money creation. So, an outward shift in aggregate demand raises the output only in short run. But once full employment is reached, the same increase in demand leads mainly to inflation. Now let us move to cost push theory of inflation. This theory explains inflation from the side of production costs rather than demand. Here, the price rise because it becomes more expensive to produce goods and services. The basic idea is that when cost of production increases, causing aggregate supply to shift leftward, leading to higher prices and lower output. This is why cost push inflation is often associated with stagflation. There are several causes of cost push inflation. One is wage push inflation. When trade unions demand or ask for higher wages and firms pass the increased labor cost to the consumers through higher prices. So another type or cause is profit push inflation, where the oligopolistic firms increase their markup and raise prices to protect or expand their profits. And the third cause is supply shock, especially sudden rises in oil or energy prices. When fuel becomes costlier, transportation and production costs rises across the economy. You have seen it recently also. Yeah. So due to supply shocks, the production of necessary items may become costlier and you will see a higher prices of them. Fourth is import cost inflation, where depreciation of currency makes imported raw material more expensive. India is going through an import cost inflation because India's currency is depreciating compared to USD. So it makes imported raw materials more costlier and costlier, which reflects in the increase in higher prices of goods and services that we consume in the domestic region. Now, taxation can also raise cost when indirect taxes on inputs increase the final price of the goods. So unlike demand pull inflation, where price rise because spending is too high, cost push inflation rises because production itself becomes more expensive. So the economy ends up with higher prices and lower output together. Now let us continue with the cost push framework. This is what happens when supply shifts to the left because production becomes more expensive. When that happens, price rises from P1 to P2, but real output falls from Y1 to Y2. This is why cost push inflation is more serious. Why? It does not only create inflation, it reduces production and inflation. That combination of inflation with unemployment is known as stagflation. So please note the definition of stagflation. It may come for 2 marks in your examination. So the important point here is that stagflation creates a policy dilemma. If the government uses monetary tightening to curb inflation, it makes the unemployment worse. So controlling cost push inflation only through demand contraction can make the recession more deeper. That is why supply side policies are often more effective in this case. These steps may include to improve production, reduce supply bottlenecks, lower input costs, and support essential industries. In short, the best remedy for cost push inflation is to increase supply rather than simply reduce demand. Here, the economy faces a difficult situation. Prices are rising, but the output is falling at the same time. So the solution cannot be monetary restraint. The economy also need a stronger supply side support. Without that, economy may further fall deeper into recession where the situation of inflation and unemployment will worsen. Now let us do a comparative analysis of demand pull inflation and cost push inflation. It is very useful because it helps you to clearly distinguish the two theories in one place. Demand pull inflation is caused by excess aggregate demand. In this case, aggregate demand curve shifts right and price rises, and the output may rise until full employment is reached. and it usually occurs during an economic boom, and it is linked to the factors like money supply, government spending, better credit facilities, or in simple words, credit expansion. Cost push inflation on the other side is caused due to rising cost of production. Here, aggregate supply curves shift towards the left and price rises. Output also falls simultaneously, causing the situation of stagflation. It occurs due to supply shocks or recession. Now, and it may be caused by wage hikes, oil prices, tax rise. So, the policy responses in both the cases are also different. Demand pull inflation is generally controlled by monetary tightening and fiscal restraint, while cost push inflation is better handled through supply side measures and by providing subsidies. So the two theories differ in cause, effect, and remedy. Demand pull inflation comes from too much spending, while cost push inflation comes from the rising cost of production. One is demand driven, another one is supply driven. One may raise the output for a certain point of time, while other reduces the output and creates stagflation. Let us see the effects of inflation on production. We will see that inflation can have both positive and negative effects depending on its intensity. Mild and moderate inflation can lead to positive effects, while high and hyperinflation can lead to negative effects. On the positive effect, positive side, mild inflation can stimulate economic growth and investment, while prices rise slowly, which can lead to profit margins improvement, and entrepreneurs may feel more encouraged to expand their production. This is good for the economy because it increases the employment as well as better income level can be seen. Now, this reduces the real burden of debt for the producers. Now, Now the transmission mechanism here is simple. A rise in price level may increase the profit margins, which will lead to better investment and production, which will cause a better, more employment and generate more output. That is why mild inflation is sometimes described as virtuous cycle. On the other hand, if inflation becomes high and or hyperinflation, the effects becomes harmful. There is a fall in real saving, which will lead to decline in capital formation. This leads to rise in business uncertainty, investments weakens in the economy, there will be resources which gets misallocated, product quality suffers, and people spend more time on speculation and on hoarding. In that case, inflation becomes destabilizing. So, the main point of this whole discussion is that inflation is not always equally harmful. Mild inflation may support growth, but excessive inflation reduces productive capacity and creates economic disorder. Now, let us discuss the effects of inflation on distribution. I will explain how inflation changes the distribution of income and wealth among different groups in the society. Inflation does not affect everyone equally. Some groups gain while others lose. The first, fixed income earners, such as salaried workers and pensioners, are losers in this scenario. Their incomes usually don't rise as fast as the prices. So their in real income falls and their standard of living declines. Second, the debtors or the borrowers here gains since they repay loan in depreciated money. The real burden of debt becomes lighter for debtors and borrowers. Third, the creditors and lenders here are the losers because the real value of money they receive back becomes lower. Fourth, entrepreneurs usually gain because their profit margin widens when price rises. Fifth, the farmers may gain or lose depending upon whether output prices rise faster than the input costs. So their outcome is mixed. It depends upon whether the food prices rises fast or the input costs rises fast. And the sixth, the investors in real assets such as shares, land, real estate, or property often gain because asset values rise during inflation. So the basic conclusion is that inflation often redistributes income in such a way from the fixed earners and creditors towards the debtors, entrepreneurs, and asset holders. This is why inflation is also a problem of equity and social justice. Now we come to anti-inflationary policy, which means the set of measures used to control rising prices and stabilize the economy. These measures are divided into three parts: monetary policy, fiscal policy, and other direct measures. Monetary policy, fiscal policy, and other direct measures. Now, monetary policy, it is mainly handled by RBI and works by reducing credit and money supply in the economy. You can see the list of tools such as increasing the bank rate, repo rate, open market operation, increasing CRR, increasing SLR, and using credit rationing and selective controls. The logic behind these tools are simple. When borrowing becomes costlier or money becomes tighter, people and firms spend less. Demand falls, price pressure eases. For example, if RBI raises the repo rate, commercial banks usually pass on the higher lending cost, which reduces loans and pulls down the particular demand. Open market operation means the RBI sells the government securities that absorbs liquidity from the market. So the banks have less cash to lend. Similarly, the higher CRR and SLR force banks to keep more funds in reserve, leaving less for credit creation. Now let us come to fiscal policy. Fiscal policy means actions taken by the government. Actions taken by the government through taxation and spending. Through taxation and spending. Through taxation and spending. Now, the tools that are used under fiscal policy are reducing government expenditure, increase in direct tax, reduction in fiscal deficit and deficit financing, delaying public works program, increase in compulsory saving through bond issues, and all the fiscal policies are managed by the Ministry of Finance. The idea here is to reduce excess demand in the economy. If the government spend less or taxes more, people have less disposable income. So demand often softens and inflationary pressure falls. A lower fiscal deficit also means the government is borrowing and printing less to finance spending, which helps to control inflation. Now, there are several other measures that control inflation more directly. Number one is price control. Second, rationing is also another measure which helps in reducing the prices. Increasing production of essential goods, controlling wages through income policy, import liberalization, anti-hoarding laws, and black market laws, and indexation of wages and contracts. All these measures are useful when inflation is caused by supply, increasing supply, or hoarding, or sudden price spikes. For example, if food prices rises because of shortage, increase in supply and stopping hoarding can be more effective than only tightening money. So overall idea is that inflation can be controlled from different sides. Monetary policy reduces demand through credit control. Fiscal policy reduces spending pressure, and other measures improve the supply and prevent uh, unfair price rise. Now we move to section B, business cycle. We will introduce with business cycle, what it deals with, what are the characteristics of business cycle, what are the different phases, and what is monetary theory of business cycle. At this point, the topic shifts from inflation to the cyclical fluctuations in the economic activity. In other words, we now study why an economy moves through periods of expansion, boom, recession, and depression. This section is important because it explains the unstable movement of output, income, employment, and investment over time. It also helps us understand how economy recovers after a downturn and why disturbance keeps repeating. So, this particular idea shows us what actually happens in the world, what are the different ups and downs an economy faces. All those things are explained by business. Now we begin with the meaning of business cycle. A business cycle is wave-like fluctuation in the aggregate economic activity that moves through periods of expansion, contraction, and around the long-term trend of output, income, and employment. In simple language, the economy does not remain stable at all the time. It expands for a period, it reaches a peak, then slows down, and later enters a downturn before recovery begins again. So, this cycle is also known as trade cycle, economic cycle, or boom and bust cycle. The main features of business cycle are that they are recurrent, their cycles repeat over time, though not fully with fixed periodicity. Sometimes it may happen over 5 years. Sometimes it may take 2 decades. So it is recurrent, but it is not over a fixed periodicity. It affects all the sectors of the economy. It may be industry, it may be agriculture, it may be trade, it may be finance. It will affect all the sectors and are synchronized in a globalized world. So whenever a country faces through recovery, some other country also may face through recovery. If a country is going through depression, other country, neighboring country may also go through depression. So there are also these particular cycles are macroeconomic in nature because they involve aggregates like GDP, employment, prices, and investment. So if I have to define business cycle in One line, a business cycle is the repeated rise and fall of economic activity affecting output, income, employment, and prices over time. Now, let us go through the characteristics of a business cycle. The first characteristic is recurrence, which means business cycle repeat again and again over time. The exact timing may change, but economies keep moving through the waves of expansion and contraction. For example, a country may enjoy growth for some years, then face slowdown or recession later, and after that begin recovering again. That repeated pattern is what recurrence means. That means the cycles will repeat again and again after a certain period of time. The second is universality. The second, business cycles are found in all market economies and affect all major sectors such as industry, agriculture, trade, and finance. This means the cycle is not limited to one company or one region. For example, if the economy slows down, factories may cut output, farmers may get lower demand, traders may see sales fall, and banks may also become cautious. The third characteristic or feature of business cycle is synchronization. In a globalized economy, business cycles spread from one country to another through trade and financial linkages. For example, if a large economy enters recession, uh, its imports demand falls, foreign producers loses business, and financial market in other countries may also become unstable. So one economy cycle can affect many others. The fourth characteristic is cumulative movement. Once expansion starts, it strengthens itself through investment multiplier, credit expansion. Contraction also works in the same way in opposite direction. To understand this, think of a small rise in demand that may lead to farm to produce more, hire more workers, and pay more wages. Then workers spend more, which raises demand further, so the original increase keeps on growing. The fifth characteristic is non-periodicity. No two businesses cycles are identical in duration or in intensity. So the gap between the peaks and troughs is never same. This is why we cannot say that every recession comes exactly after 5 years or every booms last several months. Economic conditions, policy responses, external shocks, all those factors make each cycle different. The sixth characteristic is fluctuation in investment. Capital good industries such as machinery, construction, heavy industry usually show larger ups and downs than consumer goods industry. This is the reason is that investment spending is more sensitive to changes in confidence, credit, and interest rates. When businesses expect profit, they invest heavily. When fear rises, they cut investment quickly. A short way to remember the characteristic is it is recurring, universal, synchronized, cumulative, irregular in timing, and strongest in investment. So, if you are to write what are the characteristics of business cycle in one line, business cycle are recurring, universal, synchronized, cumulative, non-periodic fluctuation in economic activity with investment showing the sharpest changes. Now we come to the phases of business cycle. We can see there are five main stages through which economy moves: depression, recovery, prosperity, boom, and recession. The first phase is depression. It is the lowest point in the cycle. This particular point or these particular points, these are the points of it is also known as pro. In this phase, the production falls sharply, income falls, employment becomes very slow, and price also decline. So during depression, many factories may reduce output, some farms shut down, and workers lose jobs. Business confidence becomes weak during depressions, so farm do not want to invest or borrow. Credit also contracts because banks becomes more cautious and traders avoid taking any risk. This is the most difficult phase of the economy because the demand is weak and profits vanish. In short, depression means widespread unemployment, low output, and pessimism, that is negativity all around. The second phase is recovery, which is also known as lower turning point. Recovery is the phase when the economy begins to move upward from the trough. At this stage, investment slowly increases, employment starts improving, business confidence begins to return as farm starts producing a little, income rises and people begin to spend more. This creates a multiplier effect, meaning one increase in spending leads to further increase in income and output. Prices may also start rising slightly as demand picks up. Recovery is important because it is the turning point from depression to expansion. It is usually gradual, not sudden, and it is the first sign that the economy is healing. The third is the prosperity is the third expansion phase of the cycle. Here, the economy um, reaches a high level of output and employment, and many resources are fully used. Profits are high, production is strong, and bank credits expand. So, in this particular phase, businesses, people become more optimistic since sales are high, farms invest more, hire more workers, and increases wages. So, demand remains strong, and the economy experiences a feeling of growth and confidence. So, however, prosperity can also contain the seeds of future trouble. If the demand keeps rising too fast, shortages begin to appear and the economy may move toward a boom. Now, boom is the peak or over full employment phase. Demand becomes excessive, prices rise quickly, bottlenecks appear in production and supply. In the boom phase, firms may overinvest because of over optimism, that is excessive positivity. Speculative activity increases and people expect prices and profits to continue rising. But this condition cannot last forever because the economy is already working beyond normal capacity. Boom is dangerous because it creates inflationary pressure. So, although income and output may be high, the situation becomes unstable and soon leads to recession. Recession is the upper turning point where the boom ends. Business confidence starts falling, profits begin to decline, and the credit becomes more tighter. As order falls, farms reduce production and cut jobs. This lowers income and spending. Unemployment rises again. Once the recession deepens, the economy eventually moves back into depression. So, recession is the phase of decline after boom. It is the beginning of the downward movement in the cycle. So the full sequence of the cycle is there is a depression, then there will be recovery, then there is prosperity, then boom, then there is recession, and again depression. The sequence repeats itself again and again. As this sequence repeats again and again, business cycles are recurring in nature. The exact timing may change as we have defined in the characteristics, but the patterns of ups and downs remain a common feature of the market economies. Now, let us begin with Hawtrey's monetary theory of trade cycle. Hawtrey's monetary theory says that business cycle is mainly caused by changes in money and credit. According to him, when credit expands, the economy moves upwards. When the credit contracts, the economy moves downward. Hawtrey's main argument is that trade cycle is purely a monetary phenomenon. That was his core argument. That is, trade cycle are purely monetary phenomenon. He believed that the real factors are not independent cause of the cycle. Instead, the flow of money and credit is the real driving force behind expansion and recession. The key assumption is that bank credit is the principal source of money in the modern economy. He also gave special importance to the traders and wholesalers who are considered as key economic agents in his economy because they borrow from banks, hold stock, places orders with the producers, and therefore transmit monetary changes throughout the economy. Now, how, according to him, how expansion begins? So, expansion phase starts with banks lowering the bank rate or the interest rate. As borrowing becomes cheaper, traders borrow more money, increasing their stock holdings and place larger orders with the producers. Once the producers receive more orders, they expand output and hire more workers. This increases the income, spending, and effective demand. As this demand uh, rises further, price rises, profits increase, and the optimism spreads. This optimism encourages still more borrowing and credit expansion. So the whole process becomes cumulative. Now let us talk how contraction begins according to Hawtrey's monetary theory. The contraction phase starts when there is a pressure on bank reserves such as gold drain or reserve loss. The bank raises interest rate and restrict credit. The traders reduce borrowing, cut down stock holdings, and place fewer orders. So as order falls, producers reduce output and employment. Income and demand decline, prices fall, profits disappear, and pessimism spreads throughout the economy. In severe depression, Hawtrey said that economy may reach a credit deadlock where even very low interest rates does not or do not revive borrowing. So why Hawtrey's theory matters? Hawtrey's theory is important because it clearly shows the link between bank credit, spending, prices, and business activity. Hawtrey's theory link all four of these activities. It also explains why central bank policy such as bank rate, open market operation can influence the business cycle. A simple way to remember is it that cheap credit creates expansion, expensive credit creates contraction. Cheap credit, expansion, and expensive credit leads to contraction. So, to summarize in one line, Hawtrey's view is that the whole cycle or whole trade cycle is a monetary story. That is the simple idea. Now, let us go through the central mechanism of Hawtrey's trade theory cycle. It shows a chain reaction through which a fall or rise in the bank rate affects credit, borrowing, production, and incomes, spending, and prices. So, when bank rate falls, credits become cheaper. As a result, traders and wholesalers can borrow more from the banks and increase their stock holding and inventory. Then they can place more orders with the producers, which will lead to a better rise in employment, output, and income. Eventually, higher demand will which will lead to more spending, and this eventually the higher demand will push up the price level, which leads the economy to enter the phase of expansion. So when the bank rate rises, the opposite process begins. When credit becomes costly, traders uh, reduce borrowing, stock holdings fall, fewer orders are placed, production contracts, and employment declines. This lowers demand, income and demand, causing prices to fall, and the economy moves towards recession. The important idea here is that the cycle is transmitted through bank credit. Hawtrey believed that money and credit are the real engine of business fluctuations and not non-monetary or real factors. So, in if I were to explain the whole thing in one line, lower bank rate means more credit, more borrowing, more production, and more inflation. Higher bank rate means less credit, less borrowing, less production, and a recession. I have already discussed this particular expansion phase, but uh, let me re-explain or revise how credit expansion generates economic boom in the Hawtrey's theory. This central idea is explained in 6 steps. First, commercial banks reduce lending rates and expand credit facilities. Then traders and wholesalers borrow more money from banks and increase their stock and inventory holdings. This is the starting point of the expansion process. After that, traders place large orders with producers because they want to hold more stock. Producers respond by rising the raising the production and employment by hiring more labor which increases employment in the economy. As more worker gets jobs and income rises, higher income leads to more consumer spending. So effective demand increases. This higher demand with limited supply pushes prices upward, profit rises, and optimism spreads in the business community. The important point is that the process is cumulative. Each step strengthens the next one, so the economy keeps moving upward until the credit limit, storages, or other pressures begin to slow the boom. So, if I had to explain the whole thing in one line, cheap credits leads to more borrowing, more stock, more orders, more production, more employment, more income, and finally more prices. And boom. Now, let us go through how credit contraction causes a depression in the Hawtrey's theory. It is basically the opposite of expansion phase. When credit becomes tight, the whole economy begins to slow down. The process starts with uh, gold drain or reserve loss. That is the step one. In Hawtrey's time, boom phase, imports and gold outflows reduced bank reserves, so banks had to restrict lending to protect their position. Next, the bank raises their interest rates and commercial banks tightens the credit. Once borrowing becomes costly, the traders reduce borrowing. The traders reduce borrowing and cut down their stock holdings and cancel new orders. This immediately affects the producers who receive fewer orders and reduce production. As production falls, farms lay off workers and lower employment means lower wages, and this leads to lower consumer spending, so effectively lower effective demand. Now, this result in prices to fall, profits vanish, and pessimism spreads throughout the economy, creating a situation known as credit deadlock. So, at the severe stage of depression, Hawtrey used the term credit deadlock. This means that even if the interest rate becomes zero or very low, traders still may not borrow because the confidence is too weak. He believed that this is the point where the economy can remain stuck in depression. Prolonged depression. So, in one simple line, the whole idea can be summarized is that reserve loss leads to tighter credit reduces borrowing, reduced borrowing leads to lower orders and production, and the fall in income and demand finally pushes the economy into depression. Now let us explain or see how economy moves from depression back to expansion in Hawtrey's theory. The recovery phase begins when the forces that caused the downturn starts to weaken and confidence slowly return. First, the traders will start repaying their bank loans by selling the stocks they have accumulated earlier. As money flows back into the banks, their reserves improve and their credit creating power increases. This is important because banks can now lower interest rates again. Now, once interest rates falls, merchants and traders feels encouraged and they borrow, they place fresh orders with the producers, and entrepreneurs slowly respond by hiring more laborers and by expanding their production. As employment rises in the economy, income also rises. Then we see rise in consumer spending, which leads to a rise in effective demand. When demand starts exceeding the current supply, prices begins to rise, profits increases, and the optimism in the economy returns. The the banks uh, ease credit further and the cycle of expansion begins again. The central bank here plays an important role in the recovery by lowering the discount rate and buying securities through open market purchase, which injects liquidity into the economic system. So the recovery is basically the phase in which economy revives from depression and prepares for a new boom. Now let us go through the complete monetary mechanism of Hawtrey's trade cycle. It ties together the boom, depression, recovery, and the role of central bank in one flow. Now we can see when bank rate falls, credit increases or credit rises in the economy. Traders borrowing increases, stocks goes up, orders to the producers rises, employment and income expand, demand pushes the prices upward. That is the boom phase in Hawtrey's theory. This particular phase is the boom phase. Then the opposite happens when reserves come under pressure. The bank's credit rises, credit falls, stocks decline, then order falls, which leads to decline in employment and dim, in fall in income, which weakens the demand, which causes a fall in the prices. That leads to depression or something known as credit default. Now, the whole story begins with the credit. Credit is the engine of this particular cycle. Second, traders and wholesalers are the main transmitters because of which the cycle works. Effective demand is another essential feature which leads to the determining the spending and activity in the economy. The whole process is cumulative in nature, as expansion and contractions are self reinforcing. Then there may be credit deadlock, which means severe depression even when zero interest rates falls to revive borrowing. Now, it also notes that trade cycle are closely linked with inflation and deflation. Hawtrey's theory clearly acknowledges that particular fact. And the central bank acts as a regulator and manages the cycle through bank rate and open market operation. The summary of the whole theory is that easy credit creates boom, tight credit creates recession, and the central bank controls the process through monetary policy. Now let us come to a critical evaluation of Hawtrey's theory. It is important to list out the strengths and weaknesses of Hawtrey's theory because no theory is complete unless we judge how far it's explained the real business cycle. Now let us come to the merits. One major merit is that Hawtrey was the pioneer in explaining the cycle through money and credit. He clearly showed the role of bank and credit money supply in the business cycle, how they work, how they lead to the ups and downs in the trade cycle. He clearly showed the role of bank credit, central bank policy, and cumulative changes in the economy. Another strength in his idea is the credit deadlock, which is very useful or very close to the later Keynesian idea of liquidity trap. He also anticipated the importance of quantitative easing as an anti-depression tool. His theory is also useful for policy because it explains why bank rate and open market operation can influence business conditions. In that sense, it gives a practical monetary explanation of boom and depression. Now let us come to the limitations. The main criticism is that the theory is too simple because it treats as a it oversimplifies the trade cycle as a monetary phenomenon. In reality, real factors also matter, such as investment, psychology, technology, and structural changes. So later on, other theories came up which was based on such criticism. It also gives too much importance to traders and wholesalers, while many modern economies are driven by large corporations and are not credit dependent. It ignores the psychological factors which causes cyclical causation. Uh, Another limitation is that the theory cannot explain stagflation or supply side shock. So the overall judgment is that Hawtrey's theory is important and insightful, but not complete. It explains an important part of the business cycle, yet it needs to be supported by other theories for fuller understanding. Now, let us look into the summary of Unit 4. This is the whole chapter in a very short form so that it is useful for your final revision. Now, let us talk about inflation. Inflation means a continuous rise in the general price level. The main types are creeping, walking, galloping, and hyperinflation. Then we come to the main two theories of inflation. In demand pull inflation, price rises because aggregate demand becomes too high. In cost push inflation, price rises because the cost of production increases and the supply shifts the aggregate supply towards the left. Inflation also affects production. Mild inflation can encourage investment and output, uh, but high inflation can reduce savings, capital, and output. Then the inflation also affects distribution. Fixed earners and creditors usually lose. Debtors, entrepreneurs, and investors gain, which widens the inequality. There are various anti-inflationary policies which helps to control the inflation. The monetary tools like repo rate, CRR, open market operations, fiscal tools like taxes, reduced spending, and other measures like price control and anti-hoarding laws. All these are helpful to control inflation. Then we talked about business cycle, which are recurring rise and fall in economic activity. Its main phases are depression, recovery, boom, and recession. Now, lastly, we summarize the Hawtrey's theory. Hawtrey's theory believed that a trade cycle is a purely monetary phenomenon. Credit expansion can cause boom, and credit contraction can create depression. In this theory, bank credit and bank rate are the main driving force of the business cycle. Now, here you can see a few important questions from Unit 4. These are what topics which are most likely to come in the examination. The long answers question covers the main areas of the unit: demand pull inflation, cost push inflation, the effects of inflation on production and distribution, Hawtrey's monetary theory of trade cycle, the phases, the characteristics of business cycle, and the anti-inflationary policy. These questions that need full explanation, these are the questions that need full explanation, proper definition, and examples. Then you go through the similar short questions, and you prepare the long questions in detail and then memorize the short question in simple points. If you practice this well, you can cover almost the whole unit confidently. Thank you for listening. Prepare well for your examination and all the best.